Okay. Yeah. Okay, it's about time to begin, and then so we I hope you had good night's sleep last night. I think I sort of did. Anyway, so yeah, today is the final day and the second day of this the international conference on humanities of migration, and so. Today we are going to have two sessions. Each session has 3 distinguished scholars' presentations, and so our first session of today, meaning session 3, is going to be led by Professor In-jin Yoon. He is a professor in the Department of Sociology, Korea University, and the president of the Korean International Migration Studies Association. He received his PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago. His research interests include social psychology, international migration, ethnic and race relations, and overseas Koreans and Korean diaspora. And so he's going to preside the session 3, and then before that, so I have just a brief, quick announcement. So if you have any kind of questions and queries, please see our distinguished leader of staff and Park Hyun-jang, and then just ask him any questions, and then if he's going to solve your queries. And then and for those people, those attendees who are participating this event online, you can have interpretation, but you can hear simultaneous interpretation between English and Korean if you see the bottom of the menu. And so please choose that option. And those who are here right now, and then you can have this something like this, and then you can choose any language you wanna hear. So please welcome Professor Yoon In-jin.
Okay, thank you for the nice introduction. Good morning. Welcome to session 3, Migrating Cultural Capital. I am In-jin Yoon at Sociology Department, and I'm the president of the Korean International Migration Studies Association, which is a research association that studies international migration, immigration policy, and migrant integration. It is my honor to be the presider of this very exciting and important session. Okay. Session 3 has 3 presenters and no designated discussants. So we have plenty of time for talk and free discussions. I ask each speaker to speak about 30 minutes each, and then we'll have free questions and answer session. Let me introduce the 3 presenters first. Professor Mina Roces is a professor of history in the School of Humanities and Language, University of New South Wales, Australia. She has written quite a large number of important books on Filipino migrant women, including the recent book entitled The Filipino Migration Experience and Gender in Southeast Asia. The second speaker is Professor Lee Kwin-yu, an associate researcher at the Department of Chinese Studies and associate member at Malaysian Chinese Research Center at University Malaya. He's an expert on Malaysia Chinese studies with a special emphasis on overseas Chinese business. The third speaker is Dr. Kim Ji-yoon, who is a sociologist, and she studies urban culture, migration, and Asian cities. We can find several keywords in this session, which are labor, consumption, ethnic business, and innovation. The main theme that links these keywords is cultural capital of migrants. So I ask the speakers and people who attend this session think about the relationships among these keywords and the main theme. So without further ado, I will ask Professor Mina Roces to talk about her topic. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, I'll start. Consumption is just as important to a Filipino migrant's life as earning a living. It is the reward for all the hard work they endured overseas. Their consumer power enables them to display their improved status as middle-class Filipinos and their new identities as cosmopolitan subjects with foreign tastes. Filipino domestic workers in Italy spend their hard-earned salaries on the building and furnishing of an Italian villa in the Philippines, on the purchase of branded clothing and accessories, and on the large parties that celebrated the rites of passage, such as coming of age, debutante balls, birthdays, and wedding anniversaries. In recent years, since about 2010, they have become tourists traveling around Europe and the Philippines. All these performances of conspicuous consumption need to be considered together to analyze the semiotics of spending of a mobile ethnic group whose sites of consumption are transnationally located. The project of homemaking, of domesticity in displacement, is particularly challenging for Filipino migrants in Italy who routinely experience conflicting emotions about where home is located. Filipino domestic workers in Padova and Milan from the province of Laguna, which is about an hour and a half from Metro Manila, they've transformed the little villages of Santa Rosa, Canlubang, and Calamba into affluent neighborhoods by building Italian-style villas that remain empty all year round, waiting for the migrants' eventual return. And I'll show some photos later. These houses, which are used only for 1 month every 2 years, when the owner visits the homeland on their vacations, is where they perform domesticity by filling the house with material objects. Is home the empty house miles away from where they live and work, or is home the place where they celebrate their birthdays? I'm applying some of Pierre Bourdieu's ideas about the strategies of distinction and strategies of imitation here. As Filipino migrant domestic workers in Italy acquire economic capital, they mimic the consumption practices and tastes of the group of upper classes in both Italy and the Philippines. Since they occupy transnational spaces, they work in Italy, but they spend their money and return periodically to the Philippines. Bourdieu's data does not include the way migrants' mobile and transnational locations allow them to straddle two classes simultaneously, holding lower class in Italy, but achieving middle class in the Philippines. And the change in consumption habits allows them to gain some cultural capital as they transform themselves from provincianas, so what we call from the country with simple tastes, to urbanized cosmopolitan Filipinos. Now, migrants have studied the meaning of the house. Migration scholars have studied the meaning of the remittance house in among Mexicans and Ecuadorians and Filipinos, and usually they argue that the house is a memorial to their migration work, or one way to connect themselves from overseas to the village left behind, or fulfill their duties as filial daughters and sons of migrants. But my study moves beyond these interpretations to analyze the way consumption is imbricated in the migrants' refashioning of themselves from provincianas, from the country, to cosmopolitan subjects. I argue that the house, empty of the house empty of permanent occupants, but full of material objects, is where the migrants have redefined home as the place which expresses their new identities as middle-class Europeanized Filipinos. I suggest that the remittance house needs to be analyzed in conjunction with the migrants' other spending habits in order to highlight the special role in the migrants' public display of disposable income, which this house plays. I'm going to argue the house is quite special. So in contrast to the scholars whose pioneering work on the remittance house I'm indebted to, I analyzed the remittance house in the context of the entire gamut of migrant conspicuous consumption. And I want to focus on how it helps them form a Europeanized identity that separates them from the stigma of domestic labor. So the location of this house, which is away from their work, I'll argue, is also important because the audience of their consumer performance never actually sees the migrant in their overseas workplace. So consumption practices, including sartorial transformation, tourist travel, and grand celebrations, symbolize the migrants' refusal to be solely defined by their working selves, while the material expressions of this domesticity, furnishing the house, sends the comforting message, of course, that the migration project was a success. And this remittance house plays a very unique purpose because despite the fact that they can travel now, they have earned enough money to dress like a European middle-class Italian. I'll talk about branded goods in a minute. But as long as they're in Italy, they can't escape from the stigma or the label of domestic worker. It's only when they return home to the village for their biannual holiday that they're welcomed like celebrities, admired by all, and nobody ever talks about the reality of their employment, such as cleaning toilets or feeding pets, gardening duties, or cooking responsibilities, or bathing the elderly. No one talks about that. And of course, the NGOs say that the consequence of this is that sometimes the people back home take them for granted, and the fact that they never talk about their marginal status, that they can't speak fluent Italian and they can't find work outside the domestic sphere, that these things that they struggle with every day. So their metamorphosis into middle-class Europeanized Filipinos can only be celebrated in the Philippines inside this magnificent remittance house, because in Italy, they remain marginal as working-class domestic workers. So I'm a historian, so my sources, as I relied heavily on oral history, in-depth interviews about 23 Filipino women domestic workers, and one custode, somebody who looks after the apartment block, a housewife, I also interviewed 3 men. I also did some ethnographic work in the village of Santa Rosa, and I attended financial literacy seminars run by NGOs who want to stop migrants from conspicuous spending. I've also used personal scrapbooks of the migrants in Padova, and also Facebook as a primary source, because they like to post. Of course, it's one way of looking at self-representation, what they post. And now, Filipino workers and domestic workers in Italy, in 1995, there were around 200,000. By 2003, there were 74,000, 64% of them working as domestic workers, and mostly in the northern part where there are wealthy people who can hire them. If you want to know what their salaries are, between 700 to 1,400 euros. My own informants, there's different salaries because some of them get free rent if they live in the basement of their employer's home, or their employer sometimes provides them with a bungalow, so that affects their salary. But for example, Katie received 600 euros a month in the 1990s, but it increased to 900 euros, and in 2018 it became 1,350 euros. So it depends. Most of all of these women I've interviewed send remittances back to the Philippines. In what ways are they marginalized in Italian society? Well, their educational qualifications are not recognized. So for example, I interviewed somebody who has a bachelor's degree and was a teacher in one of the private Catholic schools, top private schools in the Philippines, but because she's not fluent in Italian and her teaching qualifications that aren't recognized, she works as a domestic worker. I also interviewed a nurse a registered nurse, who's very frustrated because it's her qualifications are not accepted. She's a domestic worker, and so she copes with it by imagining that the broom and the sweep are like the forceps and the instruments that she used to be familiar with working in the doctor's surgery. Now, how does consumption change their life? When I asked Linda how Italy had changed her, she responded with, "Before I left the Philippines, I looked like a provinciana, but now I'm no longer provinciana." Her analysis is echoed by experience of my interviewees who said they learned new habits by mimicking their employer's taste. So for example, when they were in the province, they hardly wore dress or makeup. They wore pants. They didn't wear dresses. They didn't pay attention to the fashion. And Linda, for example, told me that the only time she ever wore lipstick was when she joined a beauty contest for Miss Commerce. So the small provincial salaries in the Philippines didn't allow them to do anything, to have much disposable income to buy consumer goods, which they would consider frivolous. But when they got to Italy, it changed all these, because when you convert, they got more disposable income, and also if they spend it in the Philippines, it'll also transform to pesos from euros, increases their wealth. Now this employers, the rich and glamorous employers, were their role models, and they learned how to apply makeup and wear branded clothing. And some of the employers are generous gift givers and gave them secondhand branded clothing. When I ran into Linda after this interview, Linda, who said she only wore a duster and never wore makeup, as a guest for one of the debutante parties I attended in Padova, she had tinted her hair blonde, her face was fully made up, and she was wearing a bright yellow pair of fashionable short shorts and boots. So domestic workers buy their clothes from United Colors of Benetton, which is only, the factory is only half an hour away from Padova. They buy clothes from Zara, Prada, Armani, handbags from Burberry, Hermes, Michael Kors, and Louis Vuitton. One of my informants got married to an Italian fiancé in a Valentino wedding gown. So Louise tells me that all the sales for high-end products that you will definitely encounter a Filipino domestic worker buying over there, because now they're able to buy that. And the purchase of the branded handbag, preferably Louis Vuitton, was the ultimate prize, a compulsory accessory that proclaimed you are a Filipino working in Italy. As Evangeline told me in an interview, quote, "Owning a Louis Vuitton bag is every girl's dream." Madonna, a single mother who worked several jobs cleaning and ironing, interrupted my interview with her so that she could fetch this bag, which I've taken a photo here, to show me. In fact, relatives in the Philippines expect them to return back to the province carrying a Louis Vuitton bag, which meant you were a Filipino working in Italy. Lucy, a very savvy Filipino domestic worker who was able to save a lot of her salary because her employer gave them a rent-free home in the basement of their house, and she was very entrepreneurial. She would sell vegetables and so on. She was able to buy several properties in her province of Santa Rosa, and her high status in the community is shown by the fact that her daughter was the princess for the Santa Cruz and May celebration, was queen of the Reina Elena, which is a Filipino fiesta which they introduced in Padova, and the person whose daughter is the queen has got to feed the whole Filipino community, so she's financially well off. Her reputation as a successful Filipina in Padova was displayed through her personal collection of branded handbags. You can see here at her 50th birthday party held at a church hall, her custom-made 260 euro birthday cake referenced her bag fetish. You can see the bottom tier is the colors of Gucci, the second tier mirrored Burberry, and the top 10 was, of course, the Michael Kors trademark. When I attend, so that's her 50th birthday. When I attended the coming of age ceremony, I could see guests also had branded handbags. In fact, when they land in the airport, they always wear European clothes, even a winter coat and boots, despite the tropical weather in the Philippines, to announce that, hey, I'm a Filipina in Italy. Some people argue, or at least one interviewee told me, that it's one way because they can't accept their status as domestic workers. So this consumption practice sort of makes up for it, for their downward social mobility. So, but I also argue that these sartorial transformations show that they refuse to be solely defined by their domestic work or by their working class status, and they want to proclaim equal status with the employers who are their equal status with their employers. So when I was in Padova for a month, I actually attended 2 of these coming of age ceremonies, and you can see the gown here is made in the Philippines by a couturier in the Philippines. This is another one. This debutante ball actually held in a church hall with 200 guests. This previous one, I had a bus. Two buses from Milan also came to attend this one, and it cost 5,000 euros. So this gown was made in the Philippines and sent to Italy precisely for the event. And she had a dance with her father, and of course, she changed her clothes 5 times at the evening, and all her friends did a kind of special dance for everybody. This mimics the tastes of Filipino elites who have their 18th-year-old birthday coming of age parties. Those who are Mexican will know it. It's like the quinceañera, the 15-year-old from Mexico. In the Philippines, it's of course held in a 5-star hotel and is much more expensive. So that's how they also spend their money. And they also go as global tourists. Here's one of the scrapbooks of one of my informants, which show you that they travel around Italy and Europe. Venice is only half an hour away from Padova, but they also go to Paris, Budapest, Croatia, London, Amsterdam, Switzerland, Puglia, Barcelona, Vienna, Slovenia, and so on. Apparently, sometimes they order or they can go on a tour for 35 euros only in a bus, 8-hour bus all the way from Padova to Vienna. In the Philippines, they also go as tourists traveling around the Chocolate Hills, the Taal Lake, and all the kind of special tourist spots that foreigners go to in the Philippines. So I want to spend a bit of time on the Italian home. Now, my Filipino migrants' periodic visits is one day they experienced domesticity in displacement, and the building of the remittance house is important. They can't own property in Italy because it's far too expensive, and so what they do is they buy a house in the Philippines. They build a house in the Philippines in a rural area where the land is much cheaper. And if you look at the house here, they also say they build it because despite the fact that a lot of them already have Italian citizenship, they plan to retire in the Philippines. And so the new house is a memorial of their hard work, and also they think they want to retire there. And they also return back for about a month or 2 every 2 years. So before that, they didn't own a house, and now they own a house. But if you can see here in the photos, they are empty all year round. The houses remain empty all year round, except for the month when the migrant comes home for every 2 years for a holiday. And they've got, it looks like an Italian house. It's not a Filipino house. The Filipinos elites also use the California style houses and not Italian. So the pastel colors, and this is marble. Actually, you can source marble from Romblon province in the Philippines. Here's another example. Again, the pastel colors. It's so clear. I took these photos, so they're not the greatest photography, but you can see that they're kind of empty. This one isn't. Sometimes they have their relatives stay there to mine until they come back, but most of them are usually empty. Like this is the only house I was allowed to enter. It's very difficult to, and I wanted about 3 houses. It's difficult to enter them because they're closely guarded by relatives, because somebody went there and made a film, and they were afraid that the people might rob it because they're empty. So now I asked Linda in my interview, why did she want an Italian villa? And she said it's because she wanted to look social. It's a colloquial term that connotes high class status, wealth, and exclusiveness. And so she had it also in a gated community. Now, Linda was a battered wife in the Philippines, and she migrated as a single mother, leaving her children in the care of her parents. And her Italian villa symbolized her spectacular achievement as a single mother turned breadwinner, able to support her family and a middle-class lifestyle. You can see inside the house, they've got a bar, but of course I've interviewed them and none of them actually drink alcohol. So it's really for show, copies to the employers. They actually get pictures of Italian houses and they send it to the Philippines to be copied. And here's some that references their many trips abroad. So some of it looks kind of kitsch. Here's a veranda. I put this here because it's hardly used because the Philippines is full of mosquitoes, so they can't really use it. But this is copies kind of the Italian style verandas that they're used to. I brought the toilet because in the Philippines they don't have a separate bidet. It's a sort of Italian practice. But Linda, who told me she has several bedrooms in her house, but the bathroom associated with her bedroom has a bidet because she got used to it when she was in Italy. And here are the toys of the kids. They're on hold in plastic, waiting for the migrant to return to play with them. And here are some of the knickknacks, the Kit Kat knickknacks they bought on their travels all around Europe. And this is to show off how they've traveled all around Pisa, London, and Salzburg in around the world. So what many NGOs have called conspicuous consumption is actually one way that they show reject working class status and express middle class. So when I read, okay, I'm near to concluding here. The Italian villa and its contents proclaims that its owner lives and works in Italy. These are not, they mimic their Italian employers and not Filipino elites, because I've done a chapter on Filipino elites, and Filipino elites decorate their house with antiques, actually totally different, and they hire professional interior designers. So the concept of what home and where it is located remains contested. Why? When Vilma returned to Santa Rosa in August 2018 for a biannual holiday, there was almost daily Facebook posts every day, I could see it, of her many social activities where her family played host in the villa. These Facebook postings stopped when she resumed her working life in Padova. She also posted photos of her family traveling to London and her special events there. In the 10 years I've been Facebook friends with Vilma, I have never seen a photograph of the bungalow that her Italian employer lets them live in rent-free. So it's the Italian villa in the Philippines which designate as their home space, where the place of feeling of being at home is performed. But yet, although Vilma decides that she's going to return to the Philippines, her husband, Bobby, confided in an interview with me in 2015 that his mind is conflicted, because when he is in Italy, he misses the Philippines, and when he's in the Philippines, he misses Italy. Bobby's confession calls attention to migrant feelings of displacement, unable to feel completely at home in one place. I'm going to make some concluding. Here's some other Filipino sent products also from Italy. So the kitchens in these houses in the Philippines have Italian cookies and so on. Filipinos send gifts in balikbayan boxes. They call it several times a year. Okay, now what I'm going to say a few conclude here. What many NGOs have criticized as conspicuous consumption could actually be interpreted as rebellion against the host country that has relegated them to be invisible and docile workers subject to the whims of their employers. Conspicuous consumption was also a coping strategy to compensate for the decision to de-skill and settle for domestic work, for some of them a source of shame. Though their self-representation most visibly by the fashion choices and social celebrations, they refuse to be solely defined by domestic work. I don't recall seeing a single Facebook post that referenced their job as domestic worker or caregiver, except for a video of 3 of them singing happy birthday in Italian as they served their elderly employer a birthday cake. But even in this video, it was the Filipinos acting as host to the Italian employer. And so it positioned them in not as marginalized subjects. Their taste in fashion, homewares, food, and travel were all acquired when they moved to Italy to work. And their role models were the wealthy Italian employers and the Filipino elite. And they wore fashionable clothing, and with their Louis Vuitton handbag accessories, they claimed equal status with their employers whose consumption practices they mimicked. So mimicking these consumption practices also increase their cultural capital. Of course, when I attended these events, I could see some small town habitus still there. Women party guests selling vegetables outside the church hall and the debutante ball. The noisy chatter that prompted the white Italian parish church administrator to scold them for disturbing Saturday night mass service. The overlong 4.5 hours amateurist program that included impromptu invitations from the guests to sing and dance, and the MC's futile efforts to get the attention of the audience could be dismissed by Filipino elite as some evidence of their provincial origins. But these same Filipino domestic workers had acquired new tastes and habits that distinguished them from their relatives in the Philippines. For example, Linda told me that she doesn't anymore eat Philippine chocolate. She'll only have Ferrero Rocher. And when I interviewed most of my informants, I met them in Cafe Pedroqui, his photograph here, which is a historical landmark at the center of Padua because it was a gathering place for Italian students and intellectuals in the 19th century next to the University of Padua. But when I invited all of them, for a drink, what drink would you like? They all ordered a spritz. And here's one of them drinking a spritz, the Italian wine-based cocktail served as an aperitif in Northeast Italy. This practice marked them as Europeanized, cosmopolitan, urbanized Filipinos. It wasn't part of their habitus when they were in the Philippines, and most Filipino women in rural areas will only drink soft drinks. And I myself, I'm allergic to alcohol and can't even order a spritz. But drinking spritz sent a clear message that they were no longer provincianas. Their consumption habits sent the message that they were middle-class, successful migrants with European tastes, not domestic workers cleaning toilets in Italy. But the building and furnishing of an Italian villa in the Philippines has a very important role to play in their public display. Because Filipinos don't tell their relatives about the loneliness, the discrimination, the hardship of the working life in Italy. So the villagers think, oh, well, they earned it without much effort. So this veiled silence on the topic of domestic work, which can be maintained in the Philippines, cannot be duplicated in Italy. And I'll end with this little story. Since I didn't have a car when I was in Padua, Lourdes kindly arranged to have Marco and Evangeline give me a little lift to Allison's debutante party. On the way there, Marco, in response to my surprise at the high price the parents paid for the party, 5,000 euros, Marco, a Filipino who was not a domestic worker, said that he couldn't understand why Filipinos would clean toilets from morning till evening, only to spend it all by feeding everybody in one night. Marco's comment was not just a critique of the conspicuous consumption of Filipinos in Padua, it pointed to the elephant in the room, that despite the attempts to show that the family could afford to give their daughter an expensive party, the reality was that the public display of wealth was not sufficient to erase the low status of domestic work. No matter how glamorous the debutante may look in her fabulous tailor-made evening gown, the audience in Padua witnessing this performance knew that the money used to pay for this one-day extravaganza came from manual labor. In this sense, the Italian villa in the Philippines was really their dream home, a space where they celebrated the consumer power of their earnings without the stigma of domestic work. Thank you for listening. I'll stop sharing now.